am live. The book is so good, I have to continue. It's the autobiography of Joan Grant. She lived from 1907 till 1989. We are now in second part of her book. Is it the second part? Yes, part 2 at the 3rd chapter. It's the life of Joanne, who was a far memory writer and well, she was amazing, really. And she explains the concept of incarnation, reincarnation, and far memory. We are here in Competence of Witches. I think this is 1920s, around the 1920s. Mother, who easily became tired of people, now took a dislike to Griffey. So I worked even harder so that there could be no excuse for her being sacked. So long as Mr. Lamb continued to write glowing letters to father about the results of the papers he sent me every 2 or 3 months, Griffey would be safe. Even when I had taken Little Go at 16, she would still have to stay for another year until I was old enough to go to Girton. For I was to work at a program arranged by Mr. Lamb, which would give me a 12-month start on the first-year undergraduates who were taking the same tripos. It was January, and I was still only 15 when Iris came back alone from Malta, where Ronald had been stationed for 2 years, to have her first baby at Seacourt. For a few days she resisted being treated as a half-witted invalid. Then she submitted to fussing, footstools, and having her bulge disguised with chiffon scarves. Women who until then had seemed perfectly ordinary human beings now revealed themselves as ghouls. Symptoms they had suffered, the more squalid the better, seemed to confer on them the right to scare poor Iris, and I did my best to defend her by staying within earshot whenever they came to call and trying to shut them up by asking direct and intimate personal questions. With one pious lady, who told Iris that it was our dear Lord's will that she should suffer torments, I lost my temper, which led me to having a considerable row from Mother. Iris knew very little more than I did about what actually happens when a baby is born. Even the doctor would only say, with false jollity, "You leave it all to me, you know all about it. I'll know all about it, and you'll know about it soon enough." "Don't let's think about it," said Iris pathetically. "But I do so wish Ronald was here, so that he could make me believe that having a baby is perfectly natural." Griffey was a broken reed. For being unmarried and 42, babies were a subject which she steadfastly put out of her mind. Fragments of information casually dropped by Mother were equally unsatisfactory. The baby ought to emerge head first, but even this was uncertain, as there was something dire called a breach, which could occur only far too easily if the expectant mother failed to take care or even run too quickly upstairs. It was useless to consult father, for about childbirth he was neither knowledgeable nor even interested. So I searched the library until I found a textbook on gynecology. After 2 long sessions with it, I put it back on the shelf and decided that Iris would be far better off without any of the information I had gleaned from its terrifying and almost incomprehensible case histories. I began to regret the absence of Blanchette, until I remembered that the poor little witch had died a virgin. She often mentioned this fact, as though it were very meritorious, and the other 2 writers had been elderly men. I tried to remember if I'd had a baby in an earlier life, but the Greek runner and the young woman who had been guillotined, the Red Indian girl and the Roman one who had taught me how to collect my tears in a medicine bottle were as barren of the required information as Joan herself. Iris prayed, and so did Griffey and I, that Ronald would be home before the baby was born. But Mother wanted the field to herself, without a son-in-law claiming even a corner of it, and her prayers were the more effective. The day he was due to leave Malta, the word flashed round the house that the pains had started. Griffey and I were banished to our sitting room. The doctor arrived. Father locked himself in his study. The maids huddled on the back stairs listening, except when they heard Mother coming along the passage. Hours passed. I took charge of the commissariat, sending up trays at intervals for the nurse and doctor, and taking orders to leave discreetly outside Father's study door. More hours passed. Griffy tried to send me to bed, but was glad of company when I told her not to be silly. I was lurking at the far end of the passage when I heard the doctor's voice speaking sharply to Mother. She came out of the room and hurried past me with tears in her eyes. Had something terrible happened? Was Iris or the baby dead? No, if they were dead, they would have gone to Father instead of shutting herself in her dressing room. Perhaps there was something I could do to help. Anyway, if the doctor told me to clear off, it would be better than lurking in doorways and in suspense. The doctor seemed quite pleased to see me. He was busy, and so was the nurse, who was dripping chloroform from a bottle onto a gaze pad she was holding over Iris' face. Iris was snoring and moaning at the same time. Then the doctor held the baby up by its heels and it began to cry. He fiddled with its middle and then wrapped it in a towel and handed it to me. Take it to your mother and tell her she's got a granddaughter, and tell her I will let her know when she can come back in here. I took the baby into the nursery next door, put it in the middle of the nurse's bed as if I was frightened of dropping it, and sent a maid to fetch Mother. Mother was very pleased with the baby, especially as it was a girl, which she had predicted. Iris and Ronald both wanted a boy. Then I remembered Griffy and found her puddling miserably by the fire. When I told her it was a girl, she burst into tears. Oh, poor Mrs. Kershaw, she wanted a boy so much. Why wasn't the doctor quick enough? Or did he deliberately refuse to do it because your mother wanted a girl? Do what? She blushed and then resolutely blew her nose. You refused to turn it inside out. Turn what inside out? Dear child, why must you always insist on being so explicit? I suppose I ought really not to tell you, but as you have already seen so much. Griffy, darling, please don't hedge. She put on her imparting information voice. Baby boys and girls, like men and women, have different reproductive organs. But these are the same thing in reverse, inside out in the case of boys, outside in the case of girls. If a doctor is competent, he can turn them in or out. So long as he does so immediately the baby is born, before the organ has time to set, which it does, like jelly, soon after it comes into contact with the air. I felt guilty for not having read the gynecology book more carefully. If I had not funked studying the text that went with the pictures, I should have been able to see that everything was done properly. By now, I would have converted a niece into a nephew. Griffy, are you quite sure? What about people who keep on trying to have their hairs for heirlooms? They would have clever doctors. Some people are so superstitious to allow this simple operation to be performed. Roman Catholics and Masons, too, I believe, are quite adamant against it. But it never occurred to me that your mother would be so prejudiced. I thought she prided herself on her medical knowledge. Otherwise, I should have warned your poor dear sister to make sure that the doctor was enlightened and competent. She hugged me. You have behaved splendidly, darling, and I'm very proud of you. There's nothing so important in the training of character as thoroughly grounding in scientific method. Witches seem to know even less than scientists about having babies, I said forlornly. Oh, damn! What is the use of remembering bits of who you were before if you don't remember anything really useful? If I had known that needless additional misery I was to suffer less than 4 years later through ignorance of natural processes, I should have felt even more forlorn. A fortnight later, the war between Mother and Griffy flared up into such a blazing row that it burned up my education in a single day. Mother sacked her, and I went to Father and announced that if she went, I would never do lessons of any kind again. He was appalled. You're going to Cambridge. You must go to Cambridge. Everything is arranged. Then tell Mother that Miss Griffin is to stay, at least until I have passed Little Go. There are other governesses, he protested. You had dozens before you took a fancy to this Welsh woman. I had never felt quite so angry or so determined before. Father, you can choose between my education or giving in to Mother. You cannot have both. My dear child, you must not force such a choice on me. It is your mother's business, not mine, whom she considers suitable as your governess. She has never got on with Miss Griffiths. But I have. For her and for you, I have worked my guts out. I've done 3 years' work in 15 months. Your work has been excellent. Lamb thinks you may be a mathematical genius. Then let Miss Grevin stay. If she goes, I give you my word. My word of honour that I will never open another textbook, never go to Cambridge, never even sit for an exam. And my God, you mean it, he said despairingly, and walked off to Mother's room. They argued for hours, and Mother won. Griffy left in tears next morning, a fortnight before my 16th birthday, and that was the end of my scholastic education. Chapter 4. Mind under Matter. I'll read a little of that. I made it quite clear that for Mother to engage another governess would be a waste of the booking fee and a return fare. So, as my refuse to go to Cambridge had revived her hope of sending me, like Marjorie, to a finishing school in Paris, she got me a French maid. At first, recollecting my battles against mademoiselles, I was a little wary of Mary, but in spite of her pride in the frilliest of caps and aprons and her unfailing efforts to make me take trouble about my clothes, we soon got on very well together and chatted happily, each in our own language. She took her maiding seriously, always insisted on running my bath and then washing my back before holding out the bath towel in which she patted me dry. The other maids, whom she despised for their lack of chic, were rather unkind to her, and so, to cheer her up, I let her manicure my nails and polish my toenails, and as she was an excellent needlewoman, she made embroidered nightgowns for Mother and taught me to sew. She stayed with me for 2 years and then went to Glory Hancock. Mortimer's regiment was stationed at Aldershot, when she wrote me a vivid description of her grand success at a dance in the sergeant's mess. Certainly, my dearest mademoiselle, I shall find myself a husband who is a military man. But her plans for the future were drastically revised by appendicitis, the onset of which was so swift that she had to be taken to the military hospital in the middle of the night. Soldiers' wives were admitted in cases of emergency, but when Glory went to the women's ward the following morning, Mary was not there, nor was she in any of the private wards. Glory, now thoroughly alarmed, was about to investigate the mortuary, when a nurse recognized her. "If you are looking for the emergency you brought in last night, Mrs. Hancock, he is in C ward. I have got screens around him, but Matron thinks it might be better to put him in a private room." "Him? What are you talking about?" The surgeon was summoned and explained that during the operation a kind of tuck had come undone, which demonstrated beyond doubt that Mary was a man. Mary, now Marius, stayed with Glory until he was used to wearing the suits and shirts, the socks and ties with which she outfitted him for his new role. She helped him to write a letter breaking the news to his elderly parents. Fortunately, they were delighted to hear that God, who in spite of their prayers for an heir had provided them with 8 daughters, had suddenly relented and supplied a grown-up son. After he returned to France, Marius sent me a photograph of his wedding. He made a very handsome bridegroom, and a year later his wife presented him with twins. I did not show the photographs to Mother, although they amused Father enormously, because she was still rather touchy when any of her friends mentioned Joan's French valet. Mary was still merry when Father suddenly decided that, as he was taking a tennis side to play against Cambridge during May week, I should go with them. "But not to the dances," said Mother firmly. "She isn't out yet. 16 is far too young." It was his turn to put his foot down, and he did so with unusual success. It's not my fault that she had decided to curtail her scholastic education. Therefore, she had better put up her hair and stop pretending to be a schoolgirl. As he had only given Mother 3 days' notice, she was displeased, and so instead of taking me to London to buy clothes, my dress for the Trinity Ball was run up by Miss Seeley, the family sewing maid. Miss Seeley was a friend of mine and read me the most remarkable stories from the news of the world, which turned even an escorted journey to London into an imaginary adventure. Behind every bookstall, under every railway carriage seat, lurked white slavers, intent on carrying off nice young girls like me to Buenos Aires. The white slavers were sometimes disguised as hospital nurses who lured you into an ambulance in which you were chloroformed on the way to the docks, or as dear old ladies who suffered bags of acid drops so heavily doped that you never woke until you reached the nameless horrors in the store in South America. She was not explicit about the horrors, but shuddered when she thought of them until her orange wig trembled like a rook's nest in a gale. Do not ask me to enlarge, Miss Joan, dear, but promise me, if it should ever happen, that you will throw yourself from the window and die bravely, impaled upon the area railings, rather than suffer a fate far worse than death. Dear Miss Seeley, she was at least 70, and if her stories had any first-hand knowledge behind them, certainly she had never been in an establishment where the girls were taught to sew. Slash went her scissors through the remnants which mother could never resist buying at sales. Remnants were mother's only economy, and a more false one seldom can have existed. Odd lengths, improbable materials, shrill colours all went further to encumber the shelves of an enormous cupboard in the sewing room. Miss Seeley's repertoire was limited. The magar sleeve for day and for evening were the picture frock. 2 tubes, a small one for the bodice, the other for the skirt, as large as the material would permit, and cobbled together at the waist. My first ball dress was the harsh pink of cheap sweets, garnished with a berth of old lace, much too good to cut, so it must be gathered. In it I felt less like a human being than an upholstered dressing table. I comforted myself with the hope that, although I was bound to be an appalling flop at the dances, I could at least show to advantage in the Cambridge tennis court. But even this solace was taken from me as father changed his mind, and said that the undergraduate opposing me would be chagrined to be taken and beaten by a girl. And of course father would have been even more chagrined had his daughter been defeated by an undergraduate. To make matters worse, my nose bled ferociously at the most awkward moments during that ghastly May week. So, at the Trinity Ball, the final touch of horror was added to my appearance by an enormous Dorothy bag containing 6 of father's largest handkerchiefs, a quantity of cotton wool, and a bottle of adrenaline. Kirstine in a Lanvin frock. Lanvin frock was a tremendous success and took a passing fancy to a young man called Leslie Grant, who was at Trinity and played third string against Secord. Her brother Tommy was my official partner. I was fond of Tommy, but dancing made his feet hurt. Mine hurt too, for my slippers were soaking from walking on the wet grass of the backs, and so would not slide quickly enough on the floor of the marquee for me to get them out of the way before he trod on them. I had only 2 dances with Leslie, and spent them walking round Great Court telling him, in case he realized that he had taken my fancy as well as Kirstine's, that I was an intellectual who would never marry, as I would be too busy being a famous architect. I was thankful to get back to Hayling, and on the following day, Neville Linton, who had a tennis court at Corbett Park, where his wife, Judith Wentworth, bred Arab horses, arrived for one of his protracted visits. Their children, Anthony, Anne, and Winnie, especially Winnie, who was the same age as me, often came to stay with us, and no longer found it surprising to get meat to eat without having to steal it from the Blenheim Spaniel's dishes, as they did at home, because Lady Wentworth was such a militant vegetarian. But this time Neville came alone, and to my relief did not expect me to be a model for him, which meant standing still for hours and suffering acute boredom, as he never spoke while he was painting. Instead, he was learning to play the flute, and he liked to do so in the Dédains at night because the echoes of the court pleased him. The horn in the tennis court was too strong for me to enjoy going there alone after dark. The billiard room was all right, but the side gallery was safer taking at a run when all the lights were on, and sometimes it was better to go back to the house through the garden. Late one night, Neville was playing the flute. The court was only pleasantly airy, and I was dancing to myself on the far side of the net. Even had I known I was there, it was too dark for him to see me, so I was naked, pretending to be a Greek nymph, dancing to panpipes in a haunted grove. I leapt higher than is practicable, except in a dream, and landed with one foot arched as though I was wearing ballet shoes. There was a sound like the crack of a stock whip. "Good God, what was that?" said Neville. "I'm afraid it's me," I answered. It was. I had broken the tendon that supported the instep of my left foot. He carried me to my bedroom. He helped me into pyjamas so that Mother would not know that I had been dancing without clothes on, and then went to wake her and Father. An hour later I heard Dr. May telling them outside my door, "We must on no account let her know, poor child, but I'm afraid that Joan will never dance again." Well, I've finished this first part here of this chapter. Have a lovely Monday.